to episode 1 of the Kaiju CATACLYSM podcast. I am your host, DREAGEN, and joining me today is...
It's Ashley.
Well, I guess you're going to be joining me every day we do this.
Yeah.
So not just today. Or are you?
Stuck with
You
me.
might be you might be replaceable.
I don't know about that.
Probably not. You're probably the brains
I
of
don't
this
know about
operation. So as we said, this is the Kaiju CATACLYSM podcast, but we're not going to assume that everyone on planet Earth knows what a kaiju is, although you might have been hearing that word and name more recently in pop culture. So what is a kaiju? Well, kaiju is actually short for daikaiju, which is the Japanese word for large and or strange beast. So
Great monster.
great
Big
monster. Yeah. So in other words, Godzilla is probably the one most of you, whether you're a passive fan, a hardcore fan, or not a fan at all, have probably heard of. So if you're big, they're wrecking cities, that is considered a kaiju. In recent films, you've seen the Legendary Pictures 2014 Godzilla film. The year before that, you had Pacific Rim, which they actually referred to the monsters in that film as kaiju. And for a lot of people, that was probably their introduction to the concept of what a kaiju is. And for many, probably thought that that was a word made up. Yeah, just for that film. And while kaiju, if you watch any of these films in Japanese, whether it be just the raw or subtitled, you'll notice that whenever the word monster, if you read the subtitles and you see the word monster, if you listen closely in that sentence, you'll hear the word kaiju.
Well, there's different words for monsters, but when they're talking about the specific monster.
Yeah, when you're watching like a giant monster film, you'll hear that word come up, and that is their designation.
Daikaiju Godzilla,
Yeah.
Daikaiju Gamera.
Yeah, Daikaiju Gojira, Daikaiju Gamera. That you'll hear those names, and for a lot of the old films, that's actually what they were called. That was part of the title, and that is a specific reference. Whereas, difference for us would be the difference of saying monster versus giant monster. A monster movie could be the Wolfman, it could be the Creature from the Black Lagoon. It could be it could even be something like a Jurassic Park movie, which they're not really monsters, but they're big, but they're not knocking over like.
To the people in those movies.
Yeah, to the people in them. I guess if you look back again, chased by a T-Rex, that's pretty damn big. But they're not gonna knock over a skyscraper either. So Daikaiju, or just kaiju, is in reference to basically something that can cause citywide damage, as opposed to just flip over a few cars. So the ending of The Lost World Jurassic Park does not count as a kaiju movie when the T-Rex is running through San Diego. That's still more of a animal on the loose movie, which kind of brings us to we'll bring it to like what qualifies as a kaiju movie versus not. But first I want to know, like, what was your first introduction to this genre? What was your first kaiju movie?
My first movie was Godzilla 1998.
Ah!
Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of...
Yeah.
Well, okay, well... all right. Well, let's go on the record now. I don't like that movie, and most true kaiju fan, I know that sounds really, really elitist,
true
but...
Godzilla fans.
Well, or just kaiju fans in general. Well, yeah, don't like it. People have since become more accepting of it, because since that film, the rights to that incarnation have lapsed, and Godzilla's parent company, Toho, have since reacquired the rights to it and renamed him Zilla to distinguish him from Godzilla, and have actually introduced him to their pantheon of monsters. And actually in Godzilla Final Wars, the real Godzilla, quote-unquote, actually killed him in Sydney, Australia. So he is technically a kaiju now, but he's not considered Godzilla. But for all my ranting and ravings and the ranting and ravings of really the fandom, that movie was the introduction for a lot of people to Godzilla. Prior to that movie, Godzilla, unless you really grew up watching it like I did, renting the old VHS tapes from back in the day. VHS tapes, what are those? Relics from the past, kids. But, Godzilla was just something everyone heard the name. There was something from way back when in Japan, even though they had been making them even all through the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and even 2000s after that 1998 film. But that's how even like some of the hardcore fans that you'll read online, that was their introduction to that character. So there was a lot of good that came from that film. It wasn't the film itself, but hey, as long as it brought you to the real Godzilla, then it wasn't all bad. But what did you think when you first saw? Like, what was your first kind of initial impression, I guess?
I mean, I was 8, so I liked it.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I mean,
I was like, it's pretty cool. Why are the worms worms for?
The worms?
Remember the whole scene in the beginning where they're using
where he
worms?
puts the Chernobyl and the worms come out.
I didn't really care at the end of the day. It looked cool.
Yeah.
And my young, innocent self just...
I was like in junior high or almost high school when the film came out, and I remember after I saw, I was trying to convince myself that it wasn't all bad. No, it's a new kind of Godzilla. It's the Godzilla for the modern. I was really trying really hard because that was like for me the first movie where I was introduced to the hype train.
Yeah.
Where I got on board and I just rode it from the station all the way to the final destination. And I was, so kind of like heartbroken to think that wow, this thing that this is going to sound really stupid, but hey, welcome to fandom, boys and girls, where this thing I had invested so much of myself emotionally into would be so disappointing. It was such a letdown. I was like, no, I like it. I really do like it. And for a Godzilla fan, I kind of liken it to what Star Wars fans went through when they saw The Phantom Menace for the first time, where they all came out of that theater.
It was
probably
back before the internet, before you saw all the stuff leading up to it. You went in blind, and then...
Yeah. So you basically kind of had to convince it. No, it was good. It was Star Wars. There was lightsabers, and, things were happening. There was space. It was good, right? Then you kept going back and watching it. Because like Star Wars, I went back and watched that movie, I think 2 more times in the theater. I saw it 3 times in the theaters, and I was just afterwards, I was like, no, you know what? I can't do this to myself. It's a bad movie. But anyway, I'm a bit older than you, so my first introduction to Godzilla was either Godzilla versus Hedorah, or Hedorah, which Hedorah, it's kind of a tomato. But at the time in America, it was known as Godzilla versus the Smog Monster. I think it was 1970. I forget the exact year. Or it was the American cut of the 1984 Gojira, which was Godzilla 1985, which was, if you've seen both those films, you understand it was a very stark contrast. But early on, I got the 2 extremes of Godzilla. I've got the really goofy, superhero kind of campy Godzilla, and I got the very dark and gritty Godzilla. So I'm pretty sure Hedorah was my first one, but those are my first introduction to Godzilla, and I saw that probably when I was 3 years old. So I've pretty much been a lifelong Godzilla fan. I know I saw both before I was old enough to remember seeing them. So pretty much since, as far back as I can remember, I've been a Godzilla fan. So yeah, I mean, it's just one of those things. I think you see these movies. I think it helps if you're introduced to the characters as children, because there's something so inherently absurd about them when you really think about it. But that's kind of the beauty of it. Kaiju are kind of impossible things. That nothing can be that big, nothing can be that indestructible, and that's kind of what makes them amazing. And in that weird way, even the really dark ones are kind of, there's something about them that appeals to the kid in you, and I think that's why the genre has crossed so many kind of boundaries and borders. They can be really dark and serious to the point where it's almost a horror movie, or they can be super ridiculous and silly and funny, and everything in between, and they have been everything in between. Godzilla has been all of those, each end of the spectrum, and everything in the middle. So, with that said, what qualifies a kaiju as a kaiju? Like, what makes it a kaiju? Is it the size? Is it what they do on screen? Is there like a specific, numerical amount of property damage they have to cause? Like, this has kind of been, I don't want to say a point of contention in the fandom, because I don't want to make it sound like people are really like at odds about this, but I've talked to a number of people, and there's kind of a varying degree of what qualifies as a kaiju, and this also kind of leads into what was the first kaiju film. And most people would say the original 1954 Gojira was the original kaiju film, the film that was later recut a couple years later into Godzilla King of the Monsters, where they added American actor Raymond Burr in it to kind of westernize it a bit. But most people consider that movie, that's the first one. But if you're going to say that a kaiju is literally just defined by essentially its size and basically a giant monster in a metropolitan area.
Size and weight class.
Yeah, and basically terrassing through a city, then honestly, the first kaiju would be the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. I always get tongue-tied when I say that. The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms from 1953, which came out the year before. But then one of the other points I hear about what makes a kaiju, it's not just their size. Sure, you can be big. a whale is big, but why is a blue whale not considered a kaiju? It's like, well, for a kaiju to be a kaiju, it has to be a bit more durable. Basically, a kaiju cannot be killed or destroyed by conventional means. Like to kill one, you would have to either not be able to or have to develop a special means just for them. For the original Godzilla, the first one actually did die in the film, but they had to basically create a new kind of weapon called the oxygen destroyer that was basically something worse than him, because the original Godzilla was essentially a metaphor for the atomic bomb. So basically they say, well, how do you destroy a weapon? Well, you have to create an even deadlier weapon, and now you're stuck with that weapon. And it's kind of supposed to be, the whole film was to be a metaphor for entering the atomic age and kind of the fallout that could come from that.
Well, and kind of that each new weapon, you're going to need something worse and worse,
right.
basically.
Yeah, exactly.
It's going to keep escalating until you just destroy everything.
Yeah, it begets one thing. For Americans, the first film was kind of just a cool, big, giant monster movie. But for anyone who lived in Japan at that time, would have been around during World War II, and they would have remembered seeing Tokyo in flames from the fire bombings. They would have remembered the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and just the untold level of destruction and devastation the war caused their homeland, basically. And this isn't, I'm not going to get into the politics of war, but basically the physical fallout of what they experienced in Japan from the war, and essentially how shell-shocked as a people they were. And they hadn't dealt with it, and Godzilla was the first time they actually dealt with it publicly, what happened. So when you see in that film Tokyo completely engulfed in flames, well, those people would have remembered seeing that once upon a time. When they see just epic amounts of destruction with like bodies everywhere, they had seen that. Godzilla represented their greatest fears, essentially made flesh. So Godzilla was a very political film in that way. The fact that you couldn't shoot him and kill him, you couldn't destroy him, but basically it's like, how do you destroy a natural disaster? How do you shoot a bomb? You can't. You just basically duck and cover and hope you survive. And for me, I kind of lean a little bit more towards that. Like, it's one thing to be big, but if we can just shoot a rocket at you and bring you down, why should we care how big you are? We have guns. We can go out with a gun into the forest, and the biggest, meanest bear could jump out. And if you've got a shotgun, you just shoot it in the face and problem solved. But what happens when everything we rely on can't keep us safe? To me, that's when it ceases to be just a monster and becomes a kaiju. It's something next level.
I mean, it's kind of funny because a lot of times they're aliens too, so.
Well, yeah, the point is there's something about them that makes them,
indestructible.
Yeah,
so to
or very hard to take down, and when you do it, usually at great cost. But which kind of brings up a point. You say, okay, the 1998 Godzilla film by TriStar was your first kaiju film, but in that film they kill him by just firing a few missiles from a plane into his neck. Because if that whole film, if you watch, he's dodging like all
but then there's all the babies.
Yeah, that part in the film where it basically just turns to Jurassic Park. Yeah. But that's the thing. So is that monster technically then a kaiju? Because size-wise, sure, he's big enough.
Well, it's like it almost makes it more like a disaster movie, like a Cloverfield type thing.
But even that monster was even the Cloverfield monster was taking artillery fire. They were firing at that thing
I never actually saw it. Yeah, I just heard about it.
Oh, really? I finally watched it because I'm not a fan of the found footage thing, and I always think using found footage, even for something like a kaiju film, is kind of a waste. Kaiju are meant to be shown in all their splendor, not caught glimpses of on a shaky cam. But there were a few shots where you see them in the military just unloading on this thing and just not doing anything. But so that's the thing, okay, but if you can just shoot it, then isn't it just kind of like animal control on steroids, basically, at that point? Like, yeah, it's bad, because the reason why they took so long to kill that thing was because it kept hiding. And that's the other point, too. It's ducking them, it's dodging, it's hiding away. It's basically more like a raccoon loose in a store somewhere that you're just trying to catch, except now the raccoon can giant, it can take out buildings, but it's still like, hey, just shoot it, and it's dead. So there is no kind of message there like, oh, be careful what we do with nature. Well, no, because it's like anything else. If nature shows up, you shoot it dead. So my question to you is, does that film then qualify as a kaiju film if he was easily dispatched with conventional weapons? You see, yeah, it's kind of hard to say. I guess so. Really,
I mean, it depends on how hardcore you are about it, too, I guess.
I guess, or how you choose to define it. Because some people would say, he's big, he knocked over some buildings, he's a kaiju. Others would say, well, yeah, he's big, knocked over a building, but, you know, if you just shoot him away with, like, tanks and planes, then big deal. So, in terms of what makes a kaiju, that's kind of up to you to decide. You know, that's kind of, for me, the two... A, they have to be a certain size and weight class, for sure. Again, a T-Rex is not a kaiju, you know. It needs to be something big enough where, even if it's not as tall as a skyscraper, it could push one over. And then beyond that, if you wanted to decide, okay, how easily, you know, killed is it, basically? You know, if planes and tanks can't do it, then it's a kaiju. If they can, then it's just a big animal, essentially. So that's kind of, I guess, how you can determine for yourself. I mean, for me, I'm just like, all right, I guess if it's big enough. I mean, I still consider the 98 film a kaiju movie, certainly not a Godzilla film, but I would say it's a kaiju movie. Because, again, there's enough of it there, and quite frankly, you really can't stick it anywhere else, you know what I mean? So if that's really the only thing that doesn't really qualify him as a kaiju, then I would say, yeah, he's a kaiju, but not Godzilla.
Again, then it's kind of like, it's like King Kong in a way, too.
And that's, and that's the interesting thing, because the beast from 20,000 Fathoms was their inspiration to make Godzilla kind of a dinosaur-like creature. Prior to that, they had experimented with all different kinds of, like, designs, like in the, you know, concept phase, where at one point he almost was supposed to look like a mushroom cloud brought to life. Like, his head looked like a weird... if you go online, there's some...
Like a penis.
Yeah, well, yeah, he kind of did, honestly, which, not surprisingly, they didn't go with that design, obviously, but that was one of the ideas they were kind of working with. If he's a metaphor for the bomb, the atomic bomb, then maybe make him look like the fallout of atomic bomb. But then they kind of quickly realized that you really can't translate that to a physical creature. So they're saying, okay, what should we make him then? Well, no.
And yet they still did Hedorah.
Well, yeah.
Hedorah, whatever.
But that's okay if he's like the bad monster you're supposed to fight. But since Godzilla became kind of like the title monster, he has to kind of be, you know,
the quote-unquote hero.
Yeah, I guess better for worse. Physically, he's got to be a bit more relatable, I guess, and using a real animal kind of works, and dinosaurs were becoming popular, and I think because the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms the year before was very successful, like, okay, well, let's make him a kind of a dinosaur, reptilian kind of creature. The problem was with that film, they had used stop motion, which was the technique where you have the model, and then you kind of pose it, take a frame, pose it, and then when you kind of put it all together, it looks like it's moving. Well, Toho Studios, which is the parent company that owns Godzilla, didn't have a budget that could not. Well, they could have done it, they said, but the budget would have made it so it would have taken like 5 or 6 years for that film to be made. So
super expensive and super time consuming.
Yeah, so pseudomation it was. So then they had to alter the design to be something a man in a suit could fit into. So instead of being a quadruped like the beast, it was an upright, you know, 2-legged dinosaur, which at the time...
I was going to say at the time, that's kind of what they thought they looked like.
Well, that's the thing. At the time, Godzilla looked like a very accurate theropod dinosaur because we thought dinosaurs kind of stood up, you know, more vertical with their tails dragging on the ground. So it's ironic because as science, our understanding of dinosaur physiology has moved on, Godzilla's design has become less that of a dinosaur and more like Godzilla's design, where he now is... even though he started off as a dinosaur, he's kind of become his own thing just because now we know dinosaurs didn't look like that. So they kind of went with the suit look, but the big inspiration for Godzilla, just the idea of turning a monster loose in the city, interestingly enough, was King Kong. The original, like, I'm going to hate myself for not remembering the year it came out. It was 1933. Quick. My lovely co-host, fact check me.
Google foo, go.
Google, always saving the day. But and granted, I don't consider that film a kaiju film, even
76? Does that sound right?
That's the remake.
I don't know. I've only seen part of the, what was it, Peter Jackson one?
Yeah, that's also not the remake. Not a bad movie though. 1933. I thought it was 33, but Damn, you know, the very end, yeah, it's old. But the very end of that film, obviously Kong is brought from Skull Island to New York City, put on display, where he kind of breaks free and starts running around New York City before climbing the Empire State Building and kind of getting shot down in that iconic scene. But that was kind of, for a lot of people, the first kind of monster on the loose. But even that was kind of inspired by an earlier film, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World, where a brontosaurus, now known as a patasaurus, was brought back to civilization in London and got loose, and now it's running around London causing destruction. And then if you read the book The Lost World, it's a pterosaur that breaks out and starts flying around London. So this idea kept kind of escalating and putting a creature in a populated city and having it, wreak havoc. So when it came time to Godzilla, basically the idea was like, well, what if that is the whole movie? What if it's not some creature, we go to some lost island or some plateau where we bring like an animal back and it just gets what if it's a giant monster with basically the power of a natural disaster that comes through a city and just, wrecks it? And that's what Godzilla was. So for my money, if you want to consider The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms a kaiju movie, I'll give you that. I don't think the staples of the genre were really all seen till Godzilla in 1954, but for King Kong, I would not qualify King Kong as a kaiju, not in his original incarnation. In the 60s, there was a King Kong versus Godzilla, where they just essentially sized up Kong, made him about the same size as Godzilla, made him resilient to military attack. He had weird electrical powers in that film. If he was struck by lightning, he became stronger. So now they can't give.
Clearly, that makes sense.
Why not? Why not, right? And so in that film, Kong was a kaiju because he had the size, he had the durability. So Kong has been a kaiju, but just not in the original film. But King Kong, 1933, does stand as one of the most important, like kind of components that gave rise to the genre, because everyone at Toho who had were working on Godzilla, they were inspired by that film. They wanted essentially to kind of make something that was like that film, but kind of their own. And in doing so, created their own genre, so to speak. So if anyone wants to know, is King Kong a kaiju? It depends. They are making a new film where Godzilla and Kong are going to face off, and once again, Kong will be a kaiju in that film, especially now that Godzilla is over 300 feet tall. So the original 40, 50 foot tall Kong, I don't think would really stack up all too well. Unless he did kind of a cool, like someone was suggesting, like they do kind of a Die Hard thing where like Kong is like hiding behind buildings in the city and Godzilla's trying to like weed him out, almost like a big cat. So you could do something.
But then Godzilla could just be like, I'll just crush every building.
Or just use his atomic breath. Yeah, just to waste the city. So you could argue like Godzilla doesn't have that kind of time. He's got things to do, man. But all right, so the other kind of thing is like, all right, what do kaiju represent? What do these movies kind of mean? I mean, yes, they can be just kind of schlocky fun, and there have been no shortage of these films that are very much, that's all they are. Son of Godzilla. Oh, boy. Oh. Godzilla's Revenge is probably the ultimate, though, example of that. If you know what I'm talking about, go find that movie, watch it. I know it's
okay, so which one was the one where he had to help the little boy?
That was...
Is that Godzilla's Revenge?
That was Godzilla's Revenge.
Okay,
Godzilla's Revenge...
That's what I was thinking of.
Godzilla's Revenge sounds like the most epic Godzilla movie. It sounds like,
That's why I always forget that was that one.
It kind of sounds like, some old, Western, like Godzilla's like Dirty Harry or something. No.
That's what they should have called Godzilla 1984. But instead...
Godzilla's Revenge. Yeah, that actually would have worked well for that. No, but... but yeah, so Godzilla has descended into that, realm of schlock, so to speak. So
well, the 70s.
Yeah, so he's not guilty of that, or I should say Toho is not guilty of that.
I was gonna say they're just trying to make him kid friendly, man.
Well, yeah, because again, it's one of those things where like I said, kaiju kind of appeal to kids in a lot of ways. Even if the films aren't geared to them, even if they're very dark and cryptic and, gloom and doom like the original 54 film was, at the end of the day, though, no matter how dark the message, there's still a giant monster on screen, and every kid kind of responds to that. And they started to notice that these movies are resonating well with younger fans. So they kind of started just toning them down for more younger people, like teenagers and stuff like that. And they still noticed that kind of the younger kids were the kind of the bigger the draw was. So finally they just turned Godzilla into like a campy kid superhero, where now, every time a new monster threatened Japan, Godzilla came, to save the day. Probably my favorite example of this is Godzilla versus Megalon, which is, even though that's a funny film, that's got one of the most brutal fights of any Godzilla movie. They're like legit street fighting. You see Godzilla like curb stomping people. He teams up with a big robot named... or other monsters, and he teams up with a robot called Jet Jaguar, who's like putting other monsters in arm bars and breaking their arms. Like it's a kid's movie, but it's brutal as hell when they start fighting each other. But it's like they're like essentially giant superheroes, and Toho cashed in on that, and then they put him in retirement for about 10 years, starting in 1975, and then 84 came out and basically ignored every film after 54 and created, and picked up basically where that film left off and brought him back to his darker roots. And he's kind of been in that zone ever since. I mean, some of the films have been a little bit more campy and lighthearted, but Godzilla never kind of went back to being, he himself as a character never went back to being really silly and ridiculous. But okay, so then again, so what do they represent? So for you, when you think of these films, like, what do you think? Like, what do you see, or like, what's your impression?
Well, I mean, essentially what they're supposed to represent is like I guess it's gonna sound kind of corny, but like the fragility of human life, and how there's some things you just can't control, and like basically kind of show these people surviving against what I mean, it essentially is a natural disaster.
Oh yeah, no.
Is it a hurricane or is it Godzilla? Godzilla's worse, obviously, but you know what I mean. Like you can't fight it. You can't fight Mother Nature, so to speak.
Yeah, the visual fallout is very reminiscent of like an earthquake or like a volcano or like again like a hurricane.
I mean, it is about the monsters, but there's always human characters too, kind of
the good ones, folk. Yeah.
Well.
Yeah, they're usually a good kaiju film kind of shows you essentially the human toll.
You have to have that balance.
Yeah, well, you have to kind of show like why should we care that this is happening? What's the big deal if a 300-foot tall dinosaur just tromps through a city and just leaves? Like, so what? Well, when you see bodies and people dying and people having lost people, you realize it's kind of like, okay, imagine if you're in a horrible earthquake, and people get crushed and killed, buildings collapse, and now just replace the earthquake with a giant monster.
Yeah.
The end result is the same: massive amounts of destruction, people dead, billions of dollars in repair. It's a kaiju film.
It's a disaster.
It's a disaster. Yeah, it really is a disaster movie. It's funny when this past summer that San Andreas, the movie with The Rock, or Dwayne Johnson as he likes to be called now, even though he literally just looks like he's made of rock at this point. But and I watched the trailers for that movie. I'm like, you could have literally just CGI'd a giant monster, regardless of who it was, and any of those scenes, and it wouldn't have looked out of place, because that's essentially what a good kaiju film looks like. It's a natural disaster film, because they're just so big and
destructive.
I think it was Ishiro Honda, the director of the original Gojira, and he did a lot of the other ones too. He basically had said that the problem with kaiju, they're very tragic. They were born too big, too strong, or too powerful. So they're almost tragic in that sense, because they can't really exist with us anyway in this world, because it's, we're basically just ants to them. Our cities it's like a city of matchsticks. It's like they're doomed to just destroy everything we've made, because they're just on a level so far beyond us. And that's really interesting when you think about that, because they're almost tragic in that sense, because and even just in the natural order, they're always going to kind of be apart from it a little bit, because they're just too much of what they are. And I always found that kind of a really fascinating concept, because if you look at the original 1954 Gojira, it's destructive, yes, it's Godzilla's scary, but there's almost something you feel bad about him, because he's not in that film outright like evil. You don't sense like he's
just like a neutral destructive force.
Yeah, he's not good, he's not bad. He's just kind of...
He's just trying to take a stroll downtown, He didn't mean to fucking ruin everything.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's essentially the thing there, is that, yes, he kind of got, aggressive when we're firing at him, but he's kind of responding even that film more like an animal would.
And in most of them, he's just trying to get to the nuclear power plants to eat, essentially.
Well, yeah,
he absorbs the radiation or whatever.
84 really showed a good example of that, when you see Godzilla feeding off a power plant, and you realize that this is... there's it's kind of not clear how intelligent Godzilla is, and certainly different films have kind of played around with that, how smart versus how animalistic he is. But even still, even if he doesn't eat like he's not out there like basically swimming down hunting whales, I don't think. But even if he's just feeding on nuclear energy, it's still an animal feeding. It's still a predator. It still has its territory. It still has to survive in its own right. So when you look at it that way and you realize, well, Godzilla is a menace and a threat to us, but the world itself isn't falling apart. You know, the natural order is still there. It's, you know, he's bad to us, but then again, we created him. So Godzilla is the kind of the antithesis to our society, our reality as we know it, which basically, you know, so, but he's supposed to be, because Godzilla is a response to kind of our arrogance, our mistakes.
Well, and it's funny because, I mean, in a lot of the, I mean, not the original movie, obviously, but a lot of the later movies, whenever they introduce these new monsters he fights, you know, he ain't doing it to save us. He's just like, hey, get off my yard.
Yeah, basically, I always say Godzilla's basically Clint Eastwood from Gran Torino. He's just like, get off my lawn. You know, that's basically what he is. He's an animal fighting for territory, and, you know, usually he's the lesser of two evils, if you want to look at it that way. So,
and there's still destruction, but
well, yeah, but usually
he's not doing it out of the kindness of his heart.
Yeah, no, I mean, well, and some of the,
well,
because that's the other thing we should mention too. The Godzilla and really just kaiju franchises have kind of been broken up in three separate categories. There was the Showa era, which generally ran from 1954 to the mid 70s. The Heisei era, which was kind of the 80s all the way through the 90s, and there's like what people call the Millennium series, which is everything started from like 1999 all the way to like the 2000s, and now. The most recent one was the Legendary Pictures film, which people are calling that the Legendary Godzilla, because Toho Studios in 2016 is releasing Shin Gojira, which has been translated in America or retitled in the West as Godzilla Resurgence.
I thought I read that it was like Japan versus Godzilla, basically.
Well, that's the tagline they're using, because one of the questions everyone was asking, okay, is Godzilla going to fight another monster? Because Godzilla's actually only appeared by himself in a movie twice, the original 1954 and in 84 when he came back. Otherwise, there's always been another monster he's been kind of grappling with, and that's kind of what the franchise has been kind of known for, is watching Godzilla beat down other monsters, which admittedly so is really cool. And say what you will about the Legendary film, that fight at the end with him, between him and the Mutos, was one of the best. But this is, from what I'm understanding, is, aside from being the largest Godzilla, he's about, I think they said he's 118 meters. And the Legendary Godzilla, I think, was about 107 meters. So he's not that much bigger, but he is the biggest one on record. And from what I understand, that this film, he, instead of just attacking Tokyo, he's actually going to be attacking multiple cities across Japan. So essentially, he's just moving through Japan, just laying waste. So I think that's why they're saying...
Taking a road trip.
Yeah, so I think that's why they're kind of saying, it's not a versus film in the traditional sense, but they're kind of playing in there that it's, this time it's Japan versus Godzilla, where it's like, he's not here to knock over a few buildings. He's going to basically just waste the entire island, essentially. So... But from what I understand, it is him by himself, and the word Shin, depending on how you translate it, either means new or true or even like godlike. So this is the newer, truer, godlike Godzilla. But in the West, it's being titled as a Godzilla Resurgence, which also implies something else very specific, is that every Toho Godzilla film, the only, you know, whether they rewrite some of the canon, the 1954 film has always been canon. That's always been a part of the history. And then some films will ignore the films that came after. Some will acknowledge certain ones. But that film has always been canon. The 2014 film kind of played with that a little bit, where he was around in 1954 but didn't actually attack Tokyo. So they still kind of kept some of that canon. And a lot of people were wondering, okay, is this going to be in this continuity the first time we've seen Godzilla? Or will it still be a sequel to the 54 film? So obviously if he's resurging, it implies that at one point he surged. So I guess that means in 1954 Godzilla surged, therefore he can now...
That just sounds dirty.
It does sound dirty. And you know what? I didn't name the damn movie, okay? It makes sense. He's resurged. He's coming back. But I don't know, resurging, it just sounds like, you know, I don't know. That maybe not the word I would have used, you know. Godzilla to come back. I don't know.
Shut up. Stop talking.
But he's resurging this time around. So, like I said, at some point before he surged. You've got to surge if you want to resurge. So if your goal in life is to resurge at some point, surge. Surge right now.
Point taken.
Point taken. So, resurgence. So yeah, that is implying that it'll be his third time appearing by himself in a film. It will not be ignoring the 54 continuity, which is in tradition with all the Toho films. So, it sounds like it's going to be more in line with the films we've seen in that sense. However, what they have said, though, this is going to be the darkest and scariest Godzilla film ever seen. Basically, kind of going back to the 1954 roots, and we'll get to this in later shows. But they did release a quick little poster of, and you can see his face on it, and it's definitely basically the 54 design kind of hit 3 times or more with the ugly stick, as I would say, in a good way. You know, he is scary looking, but he is really probably the weirdest looking Godzilla. But you know, we'll see how that film plays out. But I mean, that's basically what kaiju are in a nutshell. I know we talked a lot about Godzilla, but quite frankly, Godzilla is the ambassador to the kaiju genre. I mean, without him,
it's like the Sailor Moon of the magical girl genre.
Yeah, which we'll talk
the head runners of their genre.
Yeah, which we'll talk in great length about in our anime podcast. So be on the lookout for that. But yeah, so I mean, if you've ever been curious to check this out and you're kind of wondering where you should start, and I know for a lot of people, this kind of thing when they learn about it's kind of like superheroes and stuff that, you know, superheroes, as we know, like Marvel, DC, they've been around for decades. There's so much material, there's different continuities, you know, there's different incarnations of different characters, different universes, dimensions, yeah, whatever you want to call it. And it's the same thing with the kaiju genre. There's so much history, there's different variations of characters, different realities. So where do you start with what's what? And I would say start with the original 1954 Gojira, because that is the kind of, you know, the benchmark for all these films. But I also understand too that it is difficult for some people. I mean, if you don't mind old films, that are in black and white, then you find, and you know, I don't know how you feel about subtitles. There are dubbed versions of these movies. The problem with that version, that to watch that film in English, you're watching kind of an edited version, so it's not just dubbed over. It is a kind of a different movie. So I would say, if you don't like reading subtitles or you're not really comfortable, get over it, because that's the best way to watch these movies. But if you don't have a problem watching older films, by all means start with that film. Otherwise, normally I would say honestly go look for the Japanese cut of the 1984 film, which has since in the West been kind of titled The Return of Godzilla. But I would even say now, honestly, start with even the legendary film, which I know some, you know, purist elitists out there, they say, well, it's not really Godzilla because it's not Toho. I'm like, well, no, it's Godzilla. Godzilla is Godzilla. You know, as long as
Toho sanctioned it.
Yeah, so. Toho executive producer, they sanctioned it. They gave their approval of that movie. So they're basically saying, hey, if we would have made that movie, we would have made it like this. So that is Godzilla. So, and I know a lot of people that was who've never watched Godzilla. You know, that was their first introduction, and most of the people who complained about that movie were like really hardcore kaiju fans like myself, which I thought was strange because I loved it. But the people who are honestly the most lenient were like not really fans, or people who just don't watch those kinds of movies, and they thought it was awesome. They're like, oh wow, Godzilla is really, really cool. I know a good buddy of mine, he took his kid sister to go, that was her first Godzilla movie, and she thought it was awesome. You know, a few people I know, that was their first Godzilla movie, and they loved it. So honestly, it's kind of the best of both worlds. It's modern. It's not black and white. You don't have to read subtitles. It's in English. It was an American production. So
it's not pseudomation.
Yeah, it's CGI, so it has contemporary special effects. So
it's a deal breaker for a lot of people.
Yeah, weirdly enough, if they don't use what they call tokusatsu special effects, which is like pseudomation and miniatures. But again, to me, it's like it's Godzilla on screen. That's what matters. I don't care how you bring him to life. But so if you're only used to watching kind of newer films or contemporary films, I would say start off with that, because it's got all the fixings of a new movie. Big budget CGI, it's American actors, you know, no subtitles. So that might be a good way for you to segue into it. That's the other thing too. The other films are foreign films, so
most likely we'll be reading subtitles.
Yeah, and that's another quick thing I want to bring up too. I've met some fans who say basically it's not just a matter of being a giant, wrecking a city, being able to, you know, withstand missile fire. It has to be Japanese, which then excludes films like Gorgo, which was a British film, Yongari, which was a South Korean film, which I don't agree with. To me, kaiju films, while maybe having traditionally originated in Japan, if you've got a giant monster wrecking a city, I don't care if it's in Sydney, Australia. I don't care if it's in Moscow. I don't care if it's in New York. It's a kaiju movie. It doesn't matter what language people are speaking. it's a kaiju. So that's one thing I will always say. It's like other things like, well, it's open to your interpretation, but that's one thing I'll say right here, right now. It does not matter what country it's from, what language they're speaking. It's a kaiju movie if it fits at least those other criteria. So don't listen to any of that, but you might run into some of that. The other thing is too is don't be turned off by elitists. I mean, I know you're not as diehard as I am, but I forced you kicking and screaming on numerous times to watch a lot of these movies. Some of which you like. I know you've become a very big Mothra fan.
Mothra and Violante are two of the best monsters.
I agree. I know Mothra is going to be in the new Legendary film.
What was the Gamera trilogy you watched? That was pretty awesome.
You mean the Rebirth of Mothra trilogy?
No, I'm talking about Gamera.
Oh, the Gamera.
I mean, Rebirth of Mothra was also bitchin', but.
Yeah, well, yeah. In the '90s, they had the it's kind of the Heisei Gamera trilogy, the 3 films are
which was awesome.
Yeah, that's
also had CG in it. It's obviously older CG, but
well, one of the guys who did the special effects in that film is one of the guys doing the new Shin Gojira, so you know there is a pedigree there. But again, with every kind of fandom, you're going to run into people who are kind of basically elitist douchebags, and they can kind of ruin it for everyone. And if you're talking to people like us who are fans of multiple fandoms, whether it's film, anime, comics, and even like music and stuff. I mean, I'm a big metal guy, and I hate to admit it though, metal is kind of notorious for having, I've always said you could have 2 metalheads in a room and they both hate each other's bands. So there's always going to run those people who just kind of spoil the party because they just think that their opinion is better than anyone else.
The only opinion.
Yeah, or that they know better. Here's the thing, if you watch these films, if you're really curious about this genre, don't let people like that turn you away, because they'll make it feel like it's an exclusive club that you're not allowed into. Well, at some point we didn't know what it was either. At some point, no one had seen a Godzilla film. I mean, not everyone's like me where they've been watching these movies since day one. There's a lot of people who are hardcore fans now who were old enough to remember a time when they did not watch these films.
Well,
so,
and again, it's also easier than ever to be a fan with the internet. I mean, when you grew up, you depended on the English releases.
Yeah, my dad would go to like the video stores and bring me back these cassette tapes. Again, what are cassette tapes? Google it.
I mean, again, it's kind of the same thing with anime. It's
whatever you could get here that was released here. And now with the internet, you can
get anything.
If you're curious about absolutely anything, Google it, and you'll find everything and anything that's ever been on it. So don't worry about what other people say. If you're legitimately interested, go check it out. Go watch it online. Go rent it. Go buy it. I mean, we live in a time where a lot of these films are now released here, and you can get the original versions or the westernized versions. So if you want to maybe start with the dub and then you can switch over to the sub, or just jump into the subtitles. So if you're a person who's only really watches contemporary films, and depending on how young you are, that might be more what you're used to. So start with a new 2014 film. Why not? It's a good movie. I don't think
probably one of the easiest to find too.
Yeah, really, you're not gonna have a hard time finding that one. I mean,
at least if you're in a murder, pretty much anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, in the English-speaking world or just the West in general. But it's one of those things where it's not my favorite Godzilla movie of all time, but it's a damn good one. If you don't mind older films or even foreign films, start with the original 1954 Gojira. That's obviously where it all began, and then from there just check it out. Just again, there's over 20 films. There's like close to, I think, 30 films now. So I mean, by all means, just dive right into it. Have fun. I mean, these movies are a lot of fun.
Some of them are a little painful, I won't lie.
Some of them are.
Most of the Showa. I'm just like, I'm confused, and what is...
The later Showa films where Godzilla was like a weird superhero, and like... But even those films...
The one where he flies.
Yeah, Godzilla flies at one point. That was the first Godzilla movie I saw, too. So I knew I was a diehard fan because I was like, man, if I can take this in, there's nothing you're going to do with God that's going to shock me. But even those films, as corny as they were fun.
They're endearing.
They're fun. They're if you take them for what they are and what they were meant to be... Yeah. They're a lot of fun. So Godzilla, there's literally something for everyone. He's a superhero. He's a villain. He's a wrathful force of nature. He's a god of destruction. He's been everything. So he can kind of appeal to any part of you, really. So check it out, and don't just stop with Godzilla. Some of the best kaiju are in the Godzilla films, but I mean, check out Gamera, check out Gappa, you check out Gorgo. And there's all these films are out there, and by all means, if you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section below. I mean, I'll try to answer as many of them as I can and make some recommendations if I can. Because again, I mean, I know I've spent my years filling my head with probably what some people would consider a lot of useless information. So if I can bestow it upon the masses in any capacity, I'm more than happy to do so. And hey, and if we can get any more people to get into these kinds of films, get into the genre, because we're in what a lot of people consider like a new kaiju renaissance, a new kaiju boom. We had Pacific Rim, we had the 2014 Godzilla. Now we have an American Godzilla cinematic universe where he's going to be fighting King Kong, and there's the new Japanese films coming out, so there's a new Gamera film coming out. So if you're ever curious about giant monster movies, this is a great time to dive in, because there's a lot of new ones, coming up, and there's plenty of old ones, on the backlog. So basically, that's been it. This has been the first episode of the Kaiju Cataclysm podcast. Again, we're going to try to get some guests on later episodes. We're going to dive more into specifics, like, news about specific movies and content that's coming up. This one, we just kind of wanted to keep it general a little bit, kind of introduce, the uninitiated, as it were, into the genre, what it all is, what it means to us, why we think it's so damn cool, and hopefully maybe you will too, having heard this, and hopefully going out and checking it out for yourself. So
there's a lot to check out.
Yeah, there is a lot to check out. Again, you won't find any shortage of it. So if you're worried about being bored, you won't. I can't guarantee you'll like it or not, but I can guarantee you will not be at a loss of anything to watch. So with that said, I want to say thank you to my lovely co-host, who's giving me the thumbs up right now. They can't see you.
I know, I realize that.
It was a funny thing when I first got into radio. I was terrible because I would be gesturing with my hands and not actually saying anything. Like, my producer kept having to kind of throw things at me from the studio to actually talk. So we might start doing some video stuff with this later on down the line. But again, if you guys have any questions, any concerns, and even any show topics, if there's anything you guys want us to talk about, again, there's a lot of new stuff coming out. So if you guys are kaiju fans, there's, you can probably guess some of the stuff we're going to be talking about in the next few episodes. But, even still, if there's something you'd like us to kind of go over, or at least just mention, or just to, if you're curious to see what our opinion of it is, by all means, again, let us know, and we'll check it out and, probably hopefully talk about it. So thank you very much for listening, and we'll catch you on the next one. Peace.